The Second Great Awakening was a sweeping religious revival movement that transformed American society from the late 18th century through the mid-19th century, roughly spanning the 1790s to the 1840s. Emerging initially on the frontier, particularly in places like Kentucky and Tennessee, and later spreading to urban centers and rural communities alike, the movement emphasized personal conversion, emotional preaching, and active lay participation. Unlike the more doctrinal First Great Awakening, this second wave leaned heavily into Arminian theology, teaching that salvation was available to all through free will, not predestined fate. Key features included massive camp meetings, revival services, and the rise of influential preachers such as Charles Grandison Finney, Lyman Beecher, and Peter Cartwright. These revivalists helped democratize religion, giving ordinary people, especially women, the poor, and African Americans, a greater role in the spiritual life of the nation. As a result, evangelical denominations like the Methodists and Baptists grew rapidly. Beyond religious life, the awakening had a profound impact on social reform movements, fueling causes such as abolitionism, temperance, women's rights, and public education. Yet it also reinforced social hierarchies and moral control, promoting a culturally conservative Protestant vision of America. The movement's legacy includes both genuine spiritual revival and lasting controversy over its role in shaping modern American religious and political identity. The Second Great Awakening swept across the United States in the early 19th century like a spiritual wildfire, igniting fervent displays of religious enthusiasm. From the crowded camp meetings of Kentucky to the frenzied revivals of New York's burned-over district, this movement was defined by mass conversions, public confessions, and emotional outpourings. While these revivals revitalized American Protestantism and democratized access to religious experience, they also introduced a volatile style of worship that some contemporaries and many later historians viewed with skepticism. Revivalist leaders such as Charles Grandison Finney deliberately engineered emotional environments designed to provoke immediate decisions for Christ. Tactics like the anxious bench, impassioned altar calls, and prolonged sermons with dramatic imagery emphasized feelings over doctrine. Critics accused revivalists of promoting emotional excess and spiritual instability rather than lasting transformation. In regions where repeated revivals occurred, communities became saturated with religious zeal, only to experience spiritual burnout, a phenomenon Finney himself acknowledged. This emotionalism, while powerful in its ability to mobilize large crowds and create mass movements, raised enduring concerns about the depth and durability of faith rooted in spectacle. As we trace the awakening's influence, it's crucial to begin by interrogating the volatile spiritual atmosphere it created and the consequences of revivalism driven more by emotional intensity than theological substance. While the Second Great Awakening is often remembered for its message of spiritual equality and salvation for all, a closer examination reveals sharp contradictions in how that message played out across lines of race and class. Revivalists preached that anyone, regardless of background, could be born again, but in practice, the movement often reinscribed the social hierarchies it claimed to transcend. African Americans, both enslaved and free, were drawn to the message of personal salvation and spiritual empowerment. However, despite their enthusiastic participation in revivals, they were frequently pushed to the margins. White-led denominations, especially in the South, discouraged black leadership and segregated worship. The founding of the African Methodist Episcopal Church by Richard Allen was itself a response to exclusion from white-dominated Methodist congregations. Even in the North, where abolitionist sentiment grew, many revivalists maintained paternalistic views and failed to support full racial equality. Likewise, the urban poor and recent immigrants, especially Irish Catholics, were often targets of moralistic reform campaigns rather than welcomed as equal participants. Revivalism tended to promote a vision of moral order rooted in middle-class Protestant norms, reinforcing boundaries rather than breaking them. In this way, the awakening paradoxically combined a message of liberation with systems of exclusion, offering spiritual freedom while perpetuating racial and class-based control. Beneath the surface of revivalist preaching and enthusiastic conversions, the Second Great Awakening gave rise to a growing effort to regulate behavior and enforce moral discipline across American society. While reform was often framed as a natural outgrowth of religious renewal, many revival-inspired movements veered into moral authoritarianism, seeking to align personal conduct with a rigid vision of Protestant virtue. Central to this trend was the temperance movement, which aimed to curb alcohol consumption not only for spiritual reasons, but also to reshape society around ideals of self-control, order, and productivity. Revivalists linked sobriety to salvation, equating spiritual health with disciplined living. Yet this vision disproportionately targeted the working class, whose drinking habits were cast as sinful and socially dangerous. Reformers often overlooked the structural causes of poverty and instead focused on individual moral failure. Similarly, Sabbatarian laws, restricting activities on Sundays, and purity campaigns were driven by evangelicals seeking to impose their values through legal and cultural pressure. This shift turned revivalism into a tool for social conformity, influencing legislation and public life in ways that blurred the line between personal piety and public control. The Second Great Awakening not only inspired private conversion, but also reoriented American Protestantism toward surveillance of morality, transforming faith into a mechanism of behavioral governance. One of the lesser-explored outcomes of the Second Great Awakening was its role in spawning sectarian fragmentation and radical religious experimentation. As revivals multiplied across the country, they created an atmosphere of intense spiritual expectation and individual empowerment, conditions that birthed new movements, prophetic claims, and ultimately deep divisions within American Christianity. The most dramatic example was the Millerite movement, led by William Miller, who predicted Christ's return in 1844. When the prophecy failed to materialize, an event known as the Great Disappointment, thousands of followers were left disillusioned. Some abandoned faith altogether, while others regrouped to form new sects, including the Seventh-day Adventists. This cycle of prophecy, failure, and fragmentation was not unique. The same revivalist energy that empowered the masses to question traditional authority also made space for visionary leaders, fringe doctrines, and the breakdown of denominational unity. Movements like Mormonism, Shakerism, and spiritualism emerged from this same ferment. The burned-over district in upstate New York, saturated by revival fires, became a hotbed of religious innovation, but also of instability. Many of these groups held apocalyptic views and rejected mainstream Protestantism altogether, highlighting how the Awakening's emphasis on personal revelation often conflicted with institutional cohesion. Rather than reinforcing a unified Christian culture, the Second Great Awakening catalyzed a pluralistic, sometimes chaotic religious landscape. In doing so, it challenged the notion of a single Protestant America and opened the door to an era of spiritual experimentation and deep theological division. The Second Great Awakening is often credited with expanding women's roles in religious life, and indeed, women were the majority of revival attendees and frequently took on leadership roles in prayer meetings, missionary societies, and reform campaigns. But a closer look reveals a paradox. While revivalism opened new avenues for women's public engagement, it also reinforced a deeply patriarchal structure that kept women in subordinate roles and limited their spiritual authority. Evangelists like Charles Finney encouraged women to testify publicly or participate in prayer, radical acts in their time, but always within controlled and gendered boundaries. Female voices were welcomed so long as they promoted revival. Their participation was often framed in maternal or moral terms, as mothers, moral guardians, or supporters of men's reform. The revival's emphasis on the virtue and influence of women in the home ultimately affirmed traditional domestic ideals rather than challenging them. Meanwhile, women who pushed further, like Lorenzo Dow's wife Peggy or later holiness preachers, were often criticized or marginalized. The revival also failed to reckon with systemic gender inequality in education, leadership, and theology. Instead of dismantling patriarchal norms, the movement often repackaged them in pious language, sanctifying women's submission as a form of spiritual service. The Second Great Awakening became a stage for women's visibility, but not their liberation. It mobilized women as workers in God's vineyard, yet kept them from the pulpit, ensuring that religious enthusiasm did not translate into ecclesiastical equality. Amid the emotional intensity and mass conversions of the Second Great Awakening, a quieter but more enduring transformation took place: the eclipse of theological rigor in favor of experiential piety. The revivalist ethos prized personal encounters with God, often characterized by dramatic emotional outbursts and spontaneous conversions, over the disciplined study of doctrine or scripture. This shift had significant long-term consequences for the intellectual life of American Protestantism. Figures like Charles Finney openly rejected traditional Calvinist theology, viewing it as too cold, abstract, and inaccessible. Instead, he promoted a pragmatic, almost mechanistic theology, asserting that revivals could be produced by the right use of means. Essentially, human effort could guarantee spiritual results. This approach democratized faith, but also flattened theological nuance, reducing salvation to a set of steps and feelings. The movement's distrust of seminaries and clergy as elitist institutions further deepened this trend. The authority of the trained theologian gave way to the charismatic preacher, and sermons shifted from exposition to exhortation. The result was a popular but shallow faith, susceptible to doctrinal confusion and easily hijacked by fringe movements or self-proclaimed prophets. Over time, this anti-intellectual streak weakened Protestant engagement with art, science, and scholarship, contributing to the widening cultural gap between evangelical religion and the academic world. What began as an effort to make faith accessible and heartfelt often ended in a retreat from critical thinking, leaving behind a religious culture that prioritized passion over principle and feeling over formation. Beneath its surface of passionate sermons and mass conversions, the Second Great Awakening was in many ways a reactionary movement, a response to profound social, economic, and cultural upheaval sweeping across the young American Republic. The early 19th century was marked by westward expansion, urbanization, industrialization, and rising immigration. For many, these changes brought disorientation and anxiety, and revivalism offered a spiritual anchor in a rapidly shifting world. The revivals thrived especially in rural and frontier areas where traditional institutions were weak or absent. Here, the revival offered not just salvation but social cohesion, reinforcing family structures, personal discipline, and moral certainty. Yet this reassertion of order often came at the expense of cultural diversity and pluralism. Revival leaders promoted a vision of America rooted in Protestant Anglo-American norms, positioning revivalism as a bulwark against the perceived chaos of modern life. Many of the reform movements that emerged from the Awakening, like temperance, Sabbath enforcement, and moral purity campaigns, were as much about reasserting control as they were about promoting holiness. The movement's energy was channeled into reshaping society to fit an idealized image of Christian order, often rejecting the messy realities of immigration, class mobility, and cultural variety. Seen in this light, the Second Great Awakening was not just a spiritual renewal, but a cultural retrenchment, a way of pushing back against the forces of modernity with a revival of pre-modern moral frameworks. As the Second Great Awakening reshaped American religious life, it also laid the foundation for a new and enduring phenomenon: the fusion of evangelical faith with national identity. What began as a movement of personal revival and social reform gradually evolved into a broader vision of America as a divinely chosen nation, morally obligated to carry out God's will at home and abroad. This potent mix of religion and patriotism planted the seeds of what we now recognize as Christian nationalism. Revivalists didn't just preach salvation, they promoted a moral mission for the country. Reform efforts like temperance, public education, Sabbath laws, and anti-slavery activism were framed as not just spiritually beneficial, but essential to America's divine destiny. The rhetoric of being a Christian nation emerged from this period, as evangelicals increasingly saw the United States as a kind of new Israel, tasked with leading the world by moral example. This perspective justified everything from missionary expansion to manifest destiny. The idea that God had specially favored America fueled religious colonization of the West, missions to Native Americans, often with cultural erasure, and eventually imperialist ventures cloaked in evangelical rhetoric. The implications were far-reaching. It blurred the lines between church and state, set expectations for moral legislation, and laid ideological groundwork for later movements that sought to impose a Protestant moral order on American society through law and policy. What started as a revival of the heart became a blueprint for national religious identity, one still debated today.